There's a photograph of Eleanor Roosevelt that most people have never seen. She's not at a podium. She's not shaking hands with a president. She's sitting at a kitchen table, alone, hands folded. And the look on her face is one you only recognize if you've carried something heavy for a very long time. Eleanor Roosevelt is remembered as one of the most consequential women of the 20th century. But behind every speech, every cause, every column she ever wrote, there was a family. 6 children she brought into the world. 6 lives that unfolded in the shadow of history. And those lives were not easy. What happened to Eleanor Roosevelt's children is one of the least told stories attached to her name. Once you know it, you will never quite see her the same way again. The world she brought them into. To understand what Eleanor's children were born into, you have to understand what Eleanor herself came from. She was born Anna Eleanor Roosevelt on October 11th, 1884, into one of New York's most prominent families. On paper, it looked like privilege. And in many ways, it was. There were houses in the city and in the country, servants, social engagements, the particular ease of inherited standing. But Eleanor's childhood was quietly devastating in ways that the fine furniture and the family name did nothing to cushion. Her mother, Anna Hall Roosevelt, was a celebrated beauty who moved through society with a confidence that Eleanor never inherited. Anna found her daughter plain and awkward, and she let Eleanor know it, not always cruelly, but consistently enough that the message landed. Eleanor grew up in her own home feeling like an imposition, like someone who didn't quite fit. That wound, installed before she was old enough to name it, would follow her for the rest of her life. Then, when Eleanor was just 8 years old, her mother died of diphtheria. She was 29. Eleanor's father, Elliot Roosevelt, the younger brother of Theodore Roosevelt, whom Eleanor adored above almost everything, was already deep in the grip of alcoholism and the kind of instability that prevented him from caring for anyone, including himself. He was sent away for periods, placed in sanitariums. Eleanor was passed between relatives. The father she loved was present only in fragments, in occasional visits and tender letters that promised more than he was ever able to deliver. Elliot died in 1894 at 34, when Eleanor was 9 years old. She was raised after that by her maternal grandmother, Mary Ludlow Hall, a woman of strict, cold routine who had already had her hands full raising her own children and had little emotional surplus for a grieving granddaughter. Eleanor spent much of her childhood feeling profoundly alone. Not dramatically alone, not in a way that anyone would have identified from the outside as a crisis, but quietly, persistently alone. The kind of alone that settles into a person and becomes the furniture of their inner life. The one period that seemed to genuinely lift her was the years she spent at Allenswood Academy, a progressive girls' school outside London, under the influence of its headmistress, Marie Souvestre. Souvestre was an intellectual force, unconventional, demanding, deeply engaged with her students in a way that recognized Eleanor's intelligence rather than her awkwardness. Eleanor later described those 3 years, from 1899 to 1902, as among the happiest of her life. But she came home at 18, as expected, to enter New York society. And within a few years, she was engaged to her 5th cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. By the time she married Franklin in March 1905, Eleanor was 20 years old, deeply insecure, and carrying years of unprocessed grief and longing for a kind of warmth she had never quite received. Franklin was charming, confident, effortlessly social. A man who filled rooms the way Eleanor had always quietly emptied them of herself. Whether that contrast was part of the attraction, or part of a pattern, or simply the randomness of who two young people happen to be when they meet? It's hard to say. What is clear is that the marriage began under the long shadow of Sarah Delano Roosevelt, Franklin's mother. Sarah was formidable in a way that the word barely captures. She had been widowed young and had devoted herself entirely to her son, and she was not, in any meaningful sense, prepared to share him. She purchased a townhouse next door to the couple's New York home, installed connecting doors between the floors, and made clear, without needing to say it outright, that she intended to remain a central presence. Sarah hired the nurses for the children. She supervised the household. She questioned Eleanor's decisions and replaced them with her own. And Eleanor, still uncertain of herself, still carrying the deep-seated belief that she was somehow not quite enough, often yielded rather than fight. In the first decade of their marriage, Eleanor did what was expected of women of her class and era. She had children, 6 of them, in 11 years. Anna, born in 1906, James, in 1907, Franklin Jr., the first child to carry that name, born in 1909, who lived only 7.5 months before dying of an illness in infancy. Elliot, in 1910. A second Franklin Jr. in 1914, and John, the youngest, in 1916. 5 children who survived into adulthood. 5 children raised inside a marriage that was slowly, quietly cracking apart, and inside a household whose emotional architecture had been shaped by grief and distance long before any of them arrived. Looking back across decades, Eleanor would say, with a candor that surprised even people who knew her well, that she had no real idea how to be a mother, that she had never been taught warmth, that she understood discipline and duty and the management of a household, but that tenderness, the instinctive, easy tenderness that some mothers seem to carry naturally, had never been part of what she was given or what she learned, and that she had, without meaning to, replicated some of the very coldness that had marked her own childhood. She said she was afraid of her own babies. That admission alone says more than most biographies ever manage to capture, and it sets the stage for everything that followed, for 5 lives shaped by love that was real but often hard to feel, lived inside history that left very little room for the private, ordinary work of being a family. What came next, for each of them, is where the story gets complicated and heavy and, in ways that are genuinely hard to look away from, deeply, unmistakably sad. Anna, the daughter who kept the secrets. Of all Eleanor's children, Anna was the one who stayed closest, the one who tried, in her own way, to bridge the distance between her parents and the world. And she was also, eventually, the one placed in the most impossible position of anyone in the family. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was born on May 3rd, 1906, the first child and the only daughter. She grew up in a household of competing loyalties. Her father's infectious charm, her mother's earnest but sometimes emotionally remote devotion, and her grandmother Sarah's constant, dominating presence. Anna later described her childhood as one in which she never quite knew which adults' expectations she was supposed to be meeting at any given moment. The answer, most of the time, seemed to be all of them, simultaneously. As a young woman, Anna was striking, dark-haired, direct in her manner, with a sharpness of mind that she didn't always get credit for. She married young, at 23, to a stockbroker named Curtis Bean Doll in 1926. The marriage produced 2 children, Eleanor Sisty Dall and Curtis Buzzy Dall, who became minor celebrities in their own right when Franklin was elected president. Photographs of the grandchildren at the White House appeared in newspapers across the country. The public found them delightful. The image of small children running through those formal hallways during the Depression years carried a particular kind of comfort. But the marriage itself was unhappy. Curtis Dahl and Anna had little in common beyond their early attraction and their two children. There are accounts from people who knew them describing a fundamental incompatibility in temperament, in ambition, in what each of them wanted from a life. Anna and Curtis divorced in 1934, which was not a small thing in that era, not in American society generally, and especially not for the family of a sitting president. She remarried in 1935 to journalist John Bettiger. They had met while he was covering the Roosevelt campaign, and there was a genuine connection between them, shared intellectual interests, a similar curiosity about the world, a warmth that people who spent time around them could see. They moved to Seattle together, where John ran a newspaper, and for a period it seemed like Anna had found something solid, a life that belonged to her, in a way the White House years never quite could. Then came the piece of this story that most people, if they know anything about Anna Roosevelt, know. During the final years of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, and the final years of his life, he was in serious physical decline. The years in office, the weight of the war, the effects of the polio he had lived with since 1921, all of it was visible to those close to him in ways that were carefully hidden from the public. And during this period, Franklin renewed a closeness with a woman named Lucy Mercer Rutherford. Lucy Mercer had entered the Roosevelt story decades earlier, as Eleanor's social secretary in the late 1910s. The friendship that developed between Franklin and Lucy had crossed into something that nearly ended the Roosevelt marriage entirely. Eleanor had discovered letters between them in 1918, a discovery she described years later as the moment the bottom dropped out of her world. She offered Franklin a divorce. He declined, in part because his mother Sarah threatened to disinherit him entirely, and in part because divorce would have ended any prospect of a political future. Eleanor and Franklin remained married, but Eleanor later said, with characteristic plainness, that the discovery permanently altered the nature of what they were to each other. The romantic dimension of their relationship, whatever it had been, did not survive it. Now, in the early 1940s, as the war ground on and Franklin aged in front of everyone who was close to him, Lucy Mercer Rutherford, widowed, still in Franklin's orbit, was seeing him again. They exchanged letters. They met sometimes when arrangements could be made. And Anna knew. She had helped facilitate some of the arrangements. She had kept it from her mother. This is the detail that history tends to land on and then quickly move past. But it deserves a longer look, because the position Anna was in was genuinely terrible, and she had arrived there not out of cruelty, but out of love for her father, who asked her to help him, and out of the particular difficulty of being a child, even an adult child, caught between two parents in a marriage with wounds that had never fully closed. When Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, Lucy Mercer Rutherford was present. She had been there for several days. Eleanor was in Washington. A telephone call reached her, and she made the journey south. Eleanor found out, in the hours and days after Franklin's death, that Lucy had been there. And then she found out that Anna had known what that moment was like, what it felt like to be Eleanor Roosevelt, grieving a husband whose last breath she had not been present for, learning that a woman who had nearly broken her marriage was in the room instead, and that her own daughter had known and said nothing. That is something no biography can fully render. Eleanor did eventually forgive Anna. The record suggests it was not instant, and it was not without pain, but it happened. And in the years that followed, their relationship became one of the genuinely close ones of Eleanor's later life. Anna was a companion, a confidant, a presence that mattered. But Anna's own life continued to carry its own weight. Her second marriage, the one that had seemed so hopeful, ended too. John Bettiger came back from the war changed. He struggled with depression that deepened over time, with financial difficulties that compounded the strain between them, with a sense of failure that he could not seem to climb out of. He and Anna separated. Their divorce was finalized in 1949. Then, in 1950, John Bettiger died from a fall from a window in New York City. The circumstances were ruled consistent with a deliberate act. He was 50 years old. Anna was left to raise their son, John Boetiger Jr., largely on her own, while managing her own grief and whatever complicated feelings the end of that marriage had left behind. She married a third time, in 1952, to a physician named James Halstead. By most accounts, that marriage brought her genuine stability, a quieter life, a steadier companionship, something closer to peace. Anna Roosevelt Halstead died on December 1st, 1975, at 69, from throat cancer. She had spent her life navigating an almost impossible space, fiercely loyal to both of her parents, trusted by both, and carrying the weight of what that loyalty had required. She had buried one husband and grieved the loss of another. She had survived secrets that would have undone many people. And through all of it, she had kept going, much like her mother. The next of Eleanor's children carried a different kind of burden, one that was less about secrets and more about the particular pressure of being expected, from the very beginning, to become great. James, the son who carried his father's name and his father's shadows. James Roosevelt was the second child, born December 23rd, 1907. He was, in many ways, the son who tried the hardest to step into his father's footprint, and who paid for that ambition in ways that took decades to fully surface. James was large, handsome, gregarious, the Roosevelt bearing in near-perfect form. He served as his father's personal secretary in the late 1930s, which kept him at the center of power, but also meant he was constantly seen as an extension of FDR rather than his own man. That distinction followed him everywhere. He married his first wife, Betsy Cushing, in 1930. They had 2 daughters together before the marriage deteriorated. Betsy later remarried into considerable wealth. In the accounts she gave over the years, she did not describe her years with James as particularly warm. He married 3 more times after that, to Rommel Schneider in 1941, to Gladys Irene Owens in 1956, and to Mary Winskill in 1969. 4 marriages total. James served during World War II as a Marine officer, and this part of his record is entirely his own. He participated in the Makin Island raid of August 1942, an early American commando operation in the Pacific, and was awarded the Navy Cross for his conduct. Whatever questions attached to his name in peacetime, no one disputed his courage in combat. The peacetime questions, though, existed. There were financial controversies over the years, accusations that he had used his proximity to the Roosevelt name in ways that served his business interests. He denied the most serious allegations, and no formal action resulted. But the accusations returned at intervals, and they colored how Washington understood him. He did build a genuine political career of his own. He represented a California congressional district for 5 terms, from 1955 to 1965, as a consistent voice for civil rights and social welfare legislation. He ran for governor of California in 1950 and lost to Earl Warren. He ran for mayor of Los Angeles in 1969 and lost to Sam Yorty. In his later years, James wrote candidly about growing up Roosevelt, about the emotional distance, about nurses and household staff who were more consistently present than either parent, about a childhood in which love was real, but often hard to feel. He said it without accusation, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. James Roosevelt died on August 13th, 1991, at 83. He outlived most of his siblings, and in those final decades he was the one most willing to say, on the record, what it had actually cost to be raised inside greatness. If James struggled under the expectation of following his father, the next Roosevelt son seemed to struggle with something harder to name, a restlessness that no career, no marriage, no chapter of life ever quite resolved. Eliot, the one who never quite found solid ground. Elliot Roosevelt was born September 23rd, 1910, the third of Eleanor's surviving children. And if James carried his father's ambitions, Elliot seemed to carry something harder to name. He was named after Eleanor's father, Elliot Roosevelt Sr., a man Eleanor had adored above almost everything and lost before she was 10. Naming a son after him was an act of love and grief stitched together. What that name meant to the boy who carried it is unknowable from the outside. But it is the kind of detail that stays with you when you look at the shape of Eliot's life. And that shape was one of persistent, restless searching. He was married 5 times, more than any of his siblings. His marriages ranged across women from very different worlds and circumstances, and none of them, by his own account, delivered the settled feeling he appeared to be pursuing. He worked in aviation, in Texas ranching, in radio broadcasting, moving between endeavors with a frequency that made it difficult to build a sustained reputation in any one field, though he had real ability in several. During World War II, Elliot served in the Army Air Forces, flew reconnaissance missions, and rose to the rank of Brigadier General. He received multiple commendations, but his promotions drew scrutiny. Several members of Congress questioned whether his rapid advancement owed too much to his father's position as Commander-in-Chief. A congressional inquiry examined the matter without producing formal findings, but the question never fully went away. It was a version of the same problem that followed all of Eleanor's children. The name opened doors, and everything that happened after the door opened was shadowed by the question of whether you could have gotten there without it. Eliot was also the one who most openly pushed against the family's public mythology. The memoir he published in 1973, after Eleanor's death, offered a portrait of the Roosevelt household that was sometimes unflattering to both parents. A family where emotional availability had been scarce, where the public obligations of great people had crowded out the private obligations of parents. Some who had known Eleanor objected. Others felt it described something true that had simply never been said plainly before. Eleanor, who died in 1962, was not alive to respond. What Eliot seemed to be reaching for, in the memoir, in the marriages, in the restless movement between careers, was recognition, not sympathy, just acknowledgement that growing up inside a legend is its own particular kind of difficulty, that having parents who changed the world does not automatically mean you were seen clearly by them. He died in August 1990 in Scottsdale, Arizona, at 80 years old, still reaching. And then there was the one they expected the most from, Franklin Jr., the golden one and what gold costs. There is a particular kind of pressure that comes with being the one everyone expects greatness from. Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., the second child to carry that name, born August 17th, 1914, understood that pressure better than almost anyone alive. He was, by most accounts, the most physically striking of Eleanor's children. Tall, with his father's broad build and easy bearing, he combined a kind of natural magnetism with what appeared to be genuine intellectual ability. When he walked into rooms, people noticed. When he spoke, people listened. He had the gift, and make no mistake, it is a gift, one that cannot be fully taught, of making the person in front of him feel, for the duration of the conversation, like the only person in the room. He attended Groton, then Harvard, then the University of Virginia School of Law, which was his father's law school as well. Everything about his education followed the Roosevelt template precisely, and there was no indication that he was following it reluctantly. He seemed, in those years, to genuinely embrace the trajectory. He served in the Navy during World War II, commanding destroyer escorts and receiving multiple decorations for his conduct in combat: a Silver Star, a Navy and Marine Corps Medal, a Legion of Merit. The record was entirely his own. He was elected to Congress from New York's 20th Congressional District in a special election in 1949 and won re-election twice more. His record in Congress was a genuinely liberal one: civil rights, housing reform, labor protections. Then came 1960. Kennedy was running for the Democratic presidential nomination, and one of the key battlegrounds was the West Virginia primary, where Kennedy's Catholicism was seen as a liability. Franklin Jr. campaigned for Kennedy there with an effectiveness that multiple accounts describe as pivotal. Kennedy won convincingly. Franklin Jr. was seen, in Washington, as one of the people who had made it happen. President Kennedy repaid the loyalty, appointing him Undersecretary of Commerce in 1961. Lyndon Johnson later appointed him as the first chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the new federal agency created by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, charged with enforcing the law's ban on workplace discrimination. It was consequential work. But the personal life ran a different course. Franklin Jr. was married 5 times, matching his brother Elliot. His marriages began with Ethel DuPont in 1937 and moved through 4 more relationships across 5 decades. His business ventures had mixed results. And then there was the 1966 New York governor's race, where he ran on the Liberal Party ticket in the general election and was decisively defeated by Nelson Rockefeller, the clearest signal that the era of trading on the Roosevelt name in New York politics had passed. It was, by multiple accounts, painful. He had earned real things: the war record, the congressional terms, the EEOC chairmanship. And still, the measure against which he was always held was so impossibly large that real achievement barely made a dent. Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. died on August 17, 1988, his 74th birthday, from cancer, at his home in Millbrook, New York. His story has the quality of a classical tragedy. A man given every advantage, genuinely capable, genuinely accomplished, and still unable to escape the shadow of a name that was simultaneously his greatest inheritance and his most relentless burden. The youngest of the Roosevelt children would find a different way of being in the world: quieter, less driven by the need to prove something, and in some ways more surprising for it. John, the quiet one, and what quiet hides. John Aspinwall. Roosevelt was the youngest of the surviving children, born March 13, 1916. He arrived as the country was still nearly 2 decades away from the full storm of what the Roosevelt name would come to mean. Before the New Deal, before the White House, before history made his family into something that belonged to everyone. John was, by most accounts, the least publicly visible of Eleanor's children. He served in the Navy during World War II, reaching the rank of lieutenant commander. After the war, he moved into business, specifically department store retail. He worked for Filene's in Boston and later for other commercial enterprises. He was not a political figure. He was not a public intellectual. He was not someone who gave speeches or ran for office or appeared frequently in the newspapers. In a family this historically loud, that quietness is its own kind of statement. He married Irene Boyd McAlpin in 1938, and the marriage lasted until her death in 1965. By the accounts of people who knew them, it was a genuinely stable partnership, the kind of ordinary, durable commitment that tends to get overlooked precisely because it doesn't produce conflict worth recording. They had 4 children together. John, unlike several of his siblings, maintained a single marriage for its natural duration. Inside the Roosevelt sibling group, that is not a minor distinction. What is perhaps the most striking detail about John, and the one that tends to get mentioned and then quickly passed over, is his politics. In a family that was synonymous with the Democratic Party, with the New Deal, with the transformation of American liberalism in the 20th century, John Aspinwall Roosevelt was a Republican. He registered as a Republican. He voted for Dwight Eisenhower in 1952 and again in 1956. He later supported Richard Nixon. His mother, Eleanor, was one of the towering figures of the American left. She had fought for African American civil rights at considerable personal and social cost. She had championed labor rights, refugees, the United Nations, and international human rights with a moral consistency and force that few public figures of any era could match. And her youngest son voted for the other party. He did it without drama, without public declarations or pointed family arguments, at least none that entered the historical record. It was simply a steady, private divergence, a quiet insistence on his own convictions, even inside a family where conviction had always been expected to run in a specific direction. Eleanor, to her credit, does not appear to have allowed it to become a permanent breach. She and John maintained a relationship. She was a woman who had spent her adult life arguing for the dignity of people whose choices she disagreed with. It would have been strange, to say the least, if she had severed ties with a son over a ballot. But it tells you something about John, that he was willing to do it at all. That in a family where the expectation of ideological inheritance was so strong, he chose his own position and held it quietly over decades. Whatever you think of the specific politics, the act itself, the steady insistence on being a separate person with separate views, has a kind of self-possession to it that the family's more publicly compliant children perhaps never fully found. John remarried after Irene's death to Mariana Rockefeller in 1965. He died on April 27, 1981, at 65, from a heart attack. Of all the Roosevelt children, he is the most difficult to see clearly from the outside. He left fewer memoirs, fewer public statements, fewer traces in the accessible record. He lived quietly, and he died quietly. And inside a family that produced more noise per household member than almost any in American history, there is something about that quietness that feels deliberate, like a choice made early and maintained consistently to be a person rather than a symbol. Before we go deeper into what shaped all of them, there is one more child, one who almost never appears on the official list, and whose absence from it shaped everything that came after. The grief that never made the headlines. Before we go further, there is one more child, the one who is almost always missing from the list. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the first child to carry that name, was born March 18th, 1909. He died November 1st, 1909, at just 7.5 months old, from a heart condition. Eleanor had held this infant for 7 months, had watched him grow and struggle and slip away. She was 25 years old. And then she got up and kept going, had more children, ran a household, managed her mother-in-law's intrusions and her husband's political career. And the grief of that loss, the first Franklin, was folded quietly into everything that followed. Eleanor rarely spoke about that baby. The historical record on that loss is sparse. because Eleanor made it sparse. She was a woman who had been taught from early childhood that grief was private, that you kept moving, that you didn't burden others. But grief like that doesn't disappear. It travels. Sometimes it surfaces in distance, in the inability to be fully present, in the fear of loving something you might lose. Sometimes it shapes how a mother holds, or doesn't hold, the children who come after. It would be too simple, and probably wrong, to draw a straight line from the loss of an infant to the emotional complications that marked Eleanor's relationships with her surviving children. People are not that mechanical, and Eleanor was not that simple. But it would also be incomplete to tell the story of her children without acknowledging that the first one died in her arms, and that she was never quite the same after it. What Eleanor knew, and what she carried. In 1957, 5 years before her death, Eleanor Roosevelt sat down for an interview with journalist Mike Wallace. Wallace was known for pressing his subjects, for asking the questions other interviewers politely avoided. He asked her about happiness, about whether she considered herself a happy person. Her answer was something close to this, that she had learned contentment, but that happiness, in the uncomplicated sense, had perhaps never been fully available to her, that she had been a melancholy child who carried melancholy into adulthood, and that she had found purpose, which was something different from happiness, but perhaps more durable. It was an extraordinary thing for a woman of her public stature to say plainly. Eleanor spent 6 decades building a public life devoted to other people's dignity. She fought for African Americans during the Jim Crow era in ways that cost her socially and politically. She used her platform during World War II to speak up for Japanese Americans at a time when very few were willing to do so. She chaired the UN Human Rights Commission and oversaw the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She did all of that while carrying, in private, a marriage permanently altered by betrayal, a family in which closeness had never come easily, and the particular sorrow of a mother who knew she had not always given her children what they needed. She said so herself, multiple times, not as self-punishment, but as fact, the pattern and what survived it. There is a pattern that runs through the lives of Eleanor's children, not a simple one, not a clean one, but a real one. Multiple marriages, multiple divorces, financial difficulties, struggles with identity under the weight of an extraordinary name, distances, both literal and emotional. None of them lived easy lives, even the ones who found success. James in Congress, Franklin Jr. in the EEOC, Anna in her later years with James Halstead, did so alongside complications that might have crushed people carrying less resilient constitutions. And yet, none of them appear to have been cruel people. None of them became defined by bitterness. Anna spent her final years as a trusted friend to her mother. James wrote about his childhood with painful honesty but without malice. Franklin Jr. worked genuinely hard for causes his mother would have recognized. Elliot, restless as he was, kept reaching, kept trying to build something. John, quiet as he was, showed up for his own life in his own way. They were imperfect. They were complicated. They were, like almost everyone, both shaped and limited by the world they grew up in. And the world they grew up in happened to be one of the most historically significant households of the 20th century, which meant that the private fractures were always at risk of becoming public, and the ordinary struggles of growing up were always happening against a backdrop that made nothing feel ordinary. Eleanor Roosevelt outlived 3 of her 6 children. She died on November 7, 1962, at 78, from a rare form of tuberculosis, complicated by aplastic anemia. Her son Elliot died in 1990. Her son Franklin Jr. died in 1988. Her daughter Anna died in 1975. Her son James died in 1991. Her son John died in 1981. The first Franklin had died before any of them were old enough to know a brother had existed. What Eleanor left behind was enormous, politically, historically, morally. The scale of her public legacy is almost impossible to overstate. But she also left behind 5 children who had grown up in a household where love was present, but often hard to feel, where history was happening in every room, and where the private cost of greatness was paid quietly, year after year, in ways the world rarely noticed. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, and this is one of the few direct quotations attributed to her that historians consistently verify, that the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. It is the kind of line that gets printed on posters and stitched onto pillows. But there is a version of Eleanor Roosevelt that exists behind the poster. The woman who sat at kitchen tables alone, who folded her hands in her lap and looked at the distance with an expression that said she had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. Her children knew that woman. They grew up in the same house with her, and their lives, complicated, resilient, marked by the particular weight of extraordinary inheritance, are a part of her story that deserves to be told without simplification. 6 children, 5 who survived to adulthood, 5 lives shaped by history, by emotional distance, by love that was real even when it was difficult to reach. The tragedy isn't that Eleanor Roosevelt was a bad mother. The tragedy is that she was a deeply human one, wounded before she ever became a parent, trying to give what she had never been given, succeeding in some ways and falling short in others, the way that almost everyone who has ever raised a child in difficult circumstances does. Only she did it while changing the world, and the children she raised watched her do it, from a distance that was always, always a little larger than any of them wished. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. Bonaparte. For about 15 years, that name was the most powerful thing a person could carry in the Western world. 3 women wore it as sisters, not as wives, not as daughters, and between them they ruled millions of people across Italy at a time when most women had no say in their own lives at all. After the empire fell, those 3 women were still alive, and the stories of where that name went next, through exile, through generations, across an ocean, lead somewhere nobody could have predicted. Somewhere that includes, among other things, the crew of a starship, where they came from. Before any of the palaces and principalities, before the courts and the crowns, there was a house in Ajaccio. Corsica, in the late 18th century, was an island still getting used to belonging to France. It had been a Genoese possession for centuries and was sold to France in 1768, which was also the year before Napoleon was born there. The Bonapartes were a family of modest Corsican nobility, respected locally, known to the right people, but by no means wealthy. Carlo Bonaparte, the father, worked as a lawyer and managed to secure a few important connections through sheer persistence. He had 8 children who survived infancy. He died of stomach cancer in 1785 when Napoleon was 15 years old. What that left behind was Letizia Bonaparte, the mother, and a household with very little money and a great deal of ambition. Letizia has been described by everyone who knew her as iron-willed, deeply religious, and constitutionally unsentimental. She ran her family the way you run a household that expects difficulty at any moment. She responded to good news, people said, with a private reservation. The feeling that prosperity is temporary, that the wise person saves for what comes after. She never quite stopped believing that, even when her son was Emperor of France. When Corsica fractured in 1793 and the Bonapartes were identified as French loyalists, they had to leave the island with almost nothing. Letizia gathered the children, loaded what she could carry, and walked them across rough terrain in the dark to reach a ship. She was 43 years old. She didn't complain about it. This was the family that produced the three women at the center of this story. Women who had all, in their earliest years, known what it was like to have nothing, and who would, in time, know what it was to have everything. Elisa was the eldest of the sisters, born January 3rd, 1777. She had spent years at the Royal School of Saint-Cyr near Paris on a scholarship Napoleon had arranged, and she came back from it educated and sharpened in a way that few women of her time were. She married a Corsican officer named Felix Battiocchi in a civil ceremony in Marseille on May 1st, 1797. Napoleon had doubts about Battiocchi, found his military record thin, his character forgettable, but approved the match anyway. Elisa brought her husband into the orbit of power that was about to transform her family, whether Battiocchi was prepared for it or not. Pauline was born October 20th, 1780. She received no formal education and had no particular interest in politics. What she had was a quality that people around her consistently struggled to put into words. A warmth and physical presence that drew people in and made ordinary rooms feel warmer. Napoleon loved her the way you love a sibling who reminds you of a version of yourself you've left behind. She had been in love with a man named Stanislas Fréron, the proconsul of Marseille, but Letizia disapproved, and Napoleon arranged instead for her to marry General Charles Leclerc on June 14th, 1797. The same day, as it happens, that Elisa's religious ceremony was held at Napoleon's villa in Montbello. Pauline had little say in any of it. Caroline was the youngest, born March 25th, 1782. She was intelligent and ambitious in ways that people around her tended to underestimate, possibly because she stood in the shadow of Elisa's sharper personality and Pauline's radiance. She studied at the school of Madame Campan at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, where she met and fell deeply in love with Joachim Murat, a cavalry officer of Napoleon's who was handsome, daring, and consumed by the same kind of ambition she recognized in herself. She was 17. Napoleon was reluctant, finding Murat too impulsive. But Josephine, Napoleon's wife at the time, interceded on their behalf. Napoleon relented. On January 20th, 1800, Caroline Bonaparte became Madame Murat, three women from the same small island, the same modest house, the same resilient mother. Within a few years, all three would be governing Italian territories in Napoleon's name. And within a decade after that, they would have lost every single thing he had given them. But their stories don't end with the loss. They get stranger, and in some ways more interesting after the fall. And the first place to see that clearly is in the story of the sister who, of the three, came closest to ruling like a true head of state, Elisa, the one who actually governed. When Napoleon handed Elisa and Battiocchi the principalities of Piombino and Lucca in northern Italy in 1805, it was partly strategic and partly the way the Bonaparte family operated at its height, placing members of the family in positions where their personal fortunes and the empire's fortunes ran on the same track. What Napoleon probably did not anticipate fully was that Elisa would arrive in Lucca and immediately begin governing it as if she meant to leave something behind that would outlast her. She reorganized the courts. She reformed the church holdings, closing convents, nationalizing church property, streamlining a legal system that had been running on medieval customs for centuries. She commissioned roads connecting Massa and Carrara. She expanded the thermal baths at Lucca, which attracted visitors and revenue. She founded an academy at Carrara specifically for sculpture, brought in Lorenzo Bartolini to run it, and made it into one of the most respected artistic institutions in the Italian peninsula. She built hospitals. She financed schools. And while all of this was happening, she maintained a court that contemporaries consistently described as the most intellectually alive in Italy, full of artists, writers, and musicians, run with the kind of precision and cultural ambition that Elisa had absorbed at Saint-Cyr and never let go of. Bacciochi, her husband, was present for all of this. He held titles, received promotions, got made a senator, and eventually a brigade general. But he was not in charge, and everyone knew it. Napoleon had arranged it that way. They lived largely separate lives, which suited the arrangement, and by all accounts, suited both of them. In 1809, Napoleon made Elisa Grand Duchess of Tuscany, a much larger territory, with Florence as its capital and the Pitti Palace as its seat. She moved her court there and kept going in the same direction. She patronized the arts on a grander scale. She continued to reform civic institutions, and she continued to clash with her brother over money, which was a consistent theme of their relationship. Napoleon had a habit of demanding financial contributions from his siblings' territories. Elisa refused, arguing that Tuscany couldn't sustain what he was asking. He threatened to take Carrara back from her directly. She held her ground. The letters they exchanged during this period read, between the lines, like two people who respected each other too much to back down and competed with each other for exactly the same reason. Napoleon wrote about her that she had the mind and character to endure adversity. He was right. But he probably didn't imagine the adversity she'd actually have to endure. In early 1814, the Allied coalition that had been closing in on the empire reached Italy. Caroline's husband, Joachim Murat, who had been making his own arrangements with Austria, led Neapolitan forces north through the Italian peninsula as part of that alliance. Tuscany fell. Elisa and Bacciochi fled Florence. She was pregnant at the time and gave birth to her son Frederick later that year. One of her ladies-in-waiting reportedly noted, with a particular kind of bitterness, that this was happening at a moment when she had no longer any use for an heir. The Austrians arrested Elisa at Bologna. She was imprisoned in the fortress of Brünn in what is now the Czech Republic. She was released in late August 1814 and permitted to settle in Trieste under the title of Countess of Compignano. The Grand Duchess of Tuscany, the ruler of the Pitti Palace, the patron of Bartolini and the Carrara Academy, became the Countess of Compignano, living in a country house at Villa Vicentina near Cervignano. She was not permitted to return to Rome. She was not permitted to join Napoleon in his exile. She was not permitted to move freely, to use her title as she once had, or to be treated as anything other than a political inconvenience that the Austrians had decided to manage at a careful distance. What she was permitted to do was exist, quietly, in a borrowed title, in a house that was comfortable, but not hers. And still she kept going. She financed archaeological excavations in the region around Trieste. She continued to support artists whose careers she had helped build during the Lucca years. She corresponded with scholars across the Italian peninsula. The cultural and intellectual projects that had always defined her didn't stop simply because the empire had, and there is something in that refusal worth paying attention to. It was not denial. She knew exactly what had happened. It was more like a decision that who she was could not be entirely undone by who she was no longer allowed to be. In June 1820, at one of those excavation sites, she contracted a severe infection. She died on August 7th, 1820, at 43 years old. When Napoleon heard of it on the island of St. Helena, he shut himself away for several hours. When he came out, he said that Elisa was the first member of his family to have set out on the great journey and that he would follow her in a few months. He died in May 1821, 9 months later. Elisa's son, Frederick, born in 1813, died in a riding accident at 20. Her daughter, Napoleon, married an Italian count, but separated from him after a few years. Their only child, Charles, died in 1853 at 26, leaving no descendants. The line that Elisa had worked so hard to build, and which had been handed so little time to take root, ended there. Now, if Elisa's story is about what it means to govern and lose, then Caroline's story is about something different, something more uncomfortable, and in its own way, more human. It's about the calculation a person makes when they realize that loyalty and survival might not be the same thing. Caroline. The calculation that almost worked. Caroline Murat had spent years pushing her husband toward the highest rungs available to them, from Marshal of the Empire to Grand Duke of Berg and Clèves in 1806 to King of Naples in 1808. Every step upward had Caroline's ambition working alongside Joachim's considerable charm and military skill. But by the time they were actually in Naples, sitting on actual thrones, governing an actual kingdom with millions of subjects, something had shifted. Caroline was a more effective ruler than her husband was. That isn't a small thing to say. Murat was brilliant in motion, on a horse, leading a charge, moving faster than the enemy expected. He was less brilliant sitting still. During Napoleon's Russian campaign in 1812 and the German campaigns of 1813, when Murat was away, Caroline governed Naples alone. Her ministers took note. She was decisive. She managed the state's finances carefully. She maintained the court with the right balance of grandeur and efficiency. She commissioned major artworks, supported the excavations at Pompeii, promoted girls' education, and oversaw renovations of the royal residences that are still visible in Naples today. But governing well and governing safely are different things, and Caroline knew it. The Kingdom of Naples existed because Napoleon had given it to them, and if Napoleon fell, which by 1810 was looking less like an impossibility, the kingdom would go with him. So Caroline began working on a different arrangement. She turned to Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian chancellor, who had been her political admirer for years. The goal was to make Naples independent of the empire, recognized by the other European powers on its own terms, stable enough to survive regardless of what happened in Paris. Napoleon knew something was happening. He wrote letters pressing for loyalty. He reminded the Murats that he had made Joachim king to serve his system, not to build a personal dynasty. The Murats kept receiving those letters and kept making their arrangements anyway. When Napoleon's first abdication came in 1814, the Murats made their deal formally. They reached a separate peace with Austria and aligned Naples against the crumbling empire. When Napoleon found out, he said that he had always known Murat was a fool, but had believed he at least loved him, and that it was his sister who had truly engineered the betrayal. Letizia, their mother, was the hardest about it. When Caroline protested that what had happened wasn't her doing, Letizia said, according to those who were there, that even if a wife cannot stop her husband, she should at least put herself between him and the harm he causes. The calculation almost held. The Murats kept Naples. But then Napoleon escaped from Elba in March 1815 and launched the 100 Days, and the whole situation shifted again. Murat, against Caroline's advice this time, decided to ride out to support Napoleon militarily. He launched a campaign through the Italian peninsula. It was a disaster. He was defeated at the Battle of Tolentino in May 1815 and fled back to Naples. He and Caroline said goodbye. She was furious. furious at him for throwing away everything they had held on to through an act of military bravado that she had told him not to attempt. He told her, as he left, that if she ever saw him alive again, she could only conclude that he had tried to die and failed. She never saw him again. Murat made his way to France, but Napoleon, who had his own catastrophe arriving at Waterloo, refused to see him. After Waterloo, Murat made one final attempt to reclaim Naples. In October 1815, he landed on the Calabrian coast with a tiny force. Within days, he was captured. He was court-martialed by Ferdinand I, the restored Neapolitan king, and executed by firing squad on October 13, 1815, in the town of Pizzo Calabro. He was 48 years old. He reportedly refused a blindfold, gave the order to fire himself, and asked the soldiers to spare his face. Caroline fled to Austria with her 4 children. She adopted the title Countess of Lipona, Lipona being an exact anagram of Napoli. It was the kind of thing you do when you need to carry the place you've lost without being seen to do so. She lived for years at Frosdorf Castle, south of Vienna. Her mother refused to see her. Her brother Jérôme wrote that he felt no connection to her anymore. The family that had once pressed together against the world had fractured, and Caroline was on the outside of it. She was eventually permitted to move to Florence. She married Francesco MacDonald, a former Minister of War under the Kingdom of Naples, in 1830, a quiet second marriage far from any court. She bought the Grifoni Palace and lived out the remainder of her life there. Her children had scattered. Lucienne and Achille had gone to the United States. Letizia had married at Bologna, Louise at Ravenna. She died on May 18, 1839, at 57 years old, and was buried at the Chiesa di Ognissanti in Florence. The calculation Caroline had made, the one that cost her mother's forgiveness and her brother's trust, had preserved her life and her children's freedom. Whether it preserved anything else is harder to say. And those children, particularly Lucien, took the Bonaparte Murat name somewhere that none of the courts and kingdoms and crowned heads could have reached. But before we follow that thread forward, we still have one more sister to account for. The one who never sought a throne, and the one who turned out to be the only Bonaparte, brother or sister, who showed up when it mattered most. Pauline, the sister who stayed. There is a statue in Rome that most people encounter before they encounter Pauline Bonaparte herself. It sits in the Borghese Gallery, white marble, neoclassical, finished in 1808 by Antonio Canova, depicting Pauline reclining as Venus victorious, an apple resting in her open hand, her expression carrying the ease of someone who has made her peace entirely with being looked at. It is one of the finest sculptures of its era. It is also, for most people, the whole story of Pauline Bonaparte. Beautiful, posed, passive, marble. The actual woman was nothing like that. Her first marriage happened in 1797, when she was 16. She had been in love with Stanislas Fréron, but Napoleon arranged instead for her to marry General Charles Leclerc on June 14th, 1797. She had no say. Leclerc was loyal, capable, and genuinely devoted to Pauline. And eventually she came to return that feeling, though it took time. Their son, Dermide, was born in April 1798. In 1801, Napoleon sent Leclerc to Saint-Domingue, the Caribbean colony that would later become Haiti, as governor-general. His mission was to suppress the revolution led by Toussaint Louverture and restore French authority. Napoleon sent roughly 20,000 soldiers with him. Pauline and Dermide went along. She was 21 years old and had never left Europe. Saint-Domingue in 1802 was a place of extreme heat, ongoing rebellion, and yellow fever that was killing the French forces at a rate that no one had anticipated. 25 generals died of it. Tens of thousands of soldiers died of it. Pauline fell ill. Dermide fell ill. She turned the family's residence into a hospital and refused to leave. Leclerc urged her to go back to France again and again, and she refused each time. She wrote to Napoleon that she had chosen to follow her husband's fortune for good or for ill, and she intended to keep that. Leclerc died of yellow fever on November 2nd, 1802. He was 30 years old. Pauline had his body brought onto the ship and sailed back to France with it. Before departure, she cut off her hair, her most celebrated feature, the one that had drawn admiring descriptions from everyone who had ever met her, and placed it in his coffin. She arrived back in France on January 1st, 1803. She was 22 years old, a widow with a small child, and Napoleon was already arranging what came next. The chosen next husband was Prince Camillo Borghese, from one of Rome's oldest families, with money and connections and very little else to recommend him, at least from Pauline's perspective. They married in late 1803, less than a year after Leclerc's death. Camillo commissioned Canova to make the sculpture almost immediately. Canova had considered depicting Pauline as Diana. He chose Venus. The sitting and the process took several years, and the final work was unveiled in 1808, causing exactly the kind of scandal a reclining, near-nude statue of a married imperial princess might be expected to cause. Camillo reportedly disliked it and kept it largely private. Pauline reportedly had no objection to it whatsoever. Then, in August 1804, Dermide died. He was 6 years old. He had been sent to the Aldobrandini villa in Frascati and contracted a violent fever there. He had never fully recovered his health after Saint-Domingue. Pauline blamed Camillo for sending the child away from her. She called him, in private, the destroyer of her son. The marriage, already cold, became effectively a formal arrangement after that. They lived separately, Camillo eventually moving to Florence, where he maintained a long relationship with a mistress. Napoleon gave Pauline the Duchy of Guastalla in 1806, a small territory in northern Italy. She sold it almost immediately to Parma for 6 million francs, keeping only the title. She had no interest in administering a territory. This has sometimes been read as frivolity, but it was really a clear-eyed decision. She knew what kind of life she wanted, and governing a duchy was not part of it. She converted the political power she'd been given into personal independence instead. Elisa would never have done this. Caroline couldn't have. Pauline was the only one of the three who simply chose not to play the game. Her health had been fragile for years. She experienced chronic pain and gynecological illness from at least the early 1800s onward, and spent long periods confined to bed or travelling to spas in search of relief. She was also, in the way that people who live intensely often are, completely herself in a way that Roman society found deeply uncomfortable. She bathed in milk. She had herself carried in a litter by members of her staff rather than walking. She wore what she wanted and said what she thought, and took her pleasures where she found them, and she absorbed the social cost of all of this without visible concern. Then came 1814. Napoleon abdicated. He was sent to Elba, a small island off the Tuscan coast. And one by one, the Bonapartes found reasons not to go. Pauline went. She liquidated her assets, sold everything she could convert into portable wealth, and crossed to Elba. She was the only one of Napoleon's brothers or sisters who made that choice. She organized dinners and social evenings to keep Napoleon's small court from sinking into despair. She was the life of the place, the thing that kept the atmosphere from becoming a monument to what had been lost. The Borghese diamonds that Napoleon carried in his carriage when he escaped from Elba in February 1815 and launched the 100 Days. Those were Pauline's diamonds, given freely, because she believed in a cause everyone else had already let go of. After Waterloo and Napoleon's second exile to St. Helena, Pauline moved to Rome. She lived under the protection of Pope Pius VII, who had once been Napoleon's prisoner and who now sheltered the remnants of his family. She continued to try to improve her brother's conditions on St. Helena, writing letters and sending money. She was making plans to sail to the island to visit him when news arrived in 1821 that he had died. Her own health was deteriorating by then. The cause would later be recorded as a tumour on the stomach, the same family of illness that had taken their father, and, it is believed, Napoleon himself. She persuaded Pope Leo XII to help her reconcile with Camillo. He agreed. She moved to his palazzo in Florence. She died there on June 9th, 1825, at 44 years old. The accounts of her final days are consistent. She asked for a mirror. She looked at herself. She said she was still beautiful. She was dressed in her finest. She asked to be buried beside Leclerc and Dermide at the Château de Montgobert, the general and the son she had loved most, and whom she had lost first, and who had been, by most accounts, the grief she never fully set down. She was buried instead in the Borghese family vault at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. Even at the end, a Bonaparte woman did not end up where she had asked to be. Pauline left no descendants. Dermide had died at 6. There was no line to continue, no thread to follow forward into the future. The name passed out of her branch completely when she was buried in someone else's vault, in someone else's city, in a dress she had chosen herself, at least, and with an expression, by all accounts, of something very close to peace. The thread that did survive, the one that went forward into the modern world and eventually into the most unexpected places, came from Caroline, from those 4 children who scattered after Murat's execution and their mother's exile. And where that thread led is the part of the story that is almost impossible to believe until you trace it step by step. What the name became. Caroline and Joachim had 4 children: Achille, Letizia, Lucienne, and Louise. After their father was shot in Calabria and their mother fled to Austria, the 4 of them drifted in different directions across Europe. Letizia married a count at Bologna. Louise married a count at Ravenna. Achille crossed the Atlantic and settled in Florida, where he married a relative of George Washington. He had no children. Lucienne was the one through whom everything continued. His full name was Lucien Charles Murat, born in 1803 in Paris, when his parents were still Grand Duke and Duchess of Berg. He had been named Prince of Pontecorvo as a small child. He had grown up as a son of the King of Naples. And then the empire collapsed, and his father was executed, and his mother went into exile. And Lucien eventually found himself on a ship bound for the United States. A journey that was itself not without difficulty. According to accounts that circulated within the family, the ship ran into serious trouble, and Lucien was briefly taken by Spanish authorities before his brother Achille appealed to US President James Monroe for his release. He eventually made his way to Bordentown, New Jersey, where his uncle Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's eldest brother, had established his American estate, a property called Point Breeze that sat on the Delaware River and had become, for a time, a kind of informal gathering point for European exiles and American curiosity seekers alike. Lucien didn't stay there long. He traveled widely, as far as Texas and California by some accounts, before settling. In 1831, he married Caroline Georgina Fraser, a woman from Charleston, South Carolina, whose family had Scottish origins and connections to the American Revolution. They had 5 children: and none of them were princes of anything. Their son, Louis Napoleon Murat, was born in 1851. He became a military officer and, in a detail that manages to feel both improbable and entirely fitting, represented France in the equestrian events at the 1900 Paris Olympics. A Bonaparte competing for the republic that had replaced the empire his grandparents had ruled. Louis married a Russian noblewoman, Eudoxia Mikhailovna Somova. Their son, Michel Murat, later married Helena MacDonald Stallo, a woman from Cincinnati, Ohio, whose grandfather had served as a U.S. Senator from Ohio. Michel and Helena had a daughter, born in Paris in 1913. Her name was Laure Louise Napoléon Eugénie Caroline Murat, a string of imperial names attached to a woman who was born 47 years after Napoleon III's empire had itself been dissolved, in a city that had long since become a republic. In 1940, Laure's son was born in New York City. His name was René Murat Auberjonois. His father, Fernand Auberjonois, was a Swiss-born journalist and Pulitzer Prize-nominated foreign correspondent. His paternal grandfather was a well-known Swiss post-impressionist painter, and on his mother's side, he was the great-great-great-grandson of Caroline Bonaparte, Queen of Naples, youngest sister of Napoleon I of France. René Auberjonois grew up to be one of the more quietly distinguished figures in American theatre and television of the second half of the 20th century. He studied at Carnegie Mellon. He taught acting at Juilliard. He won a Tony Award on Broadway in 1970 for the musical Coco. That same year, he played Father Mulcahy in Robert Altman's M.A.S.H. He voiced Chef Lewis in Disney's The Little Mermaid in 1989, and from 1993 to 1999, he played Odo, the shape-shifting security chief on Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, a character defined by the question of what form a person truly belongs in, what identity means when you can change your shape at will, whether the form you have been given is really the form that is yours. He was, by blood, the descendant of a woman who had spent her life fighting to hold a kingdom that was never fully hers, under a name that was borrowed from her brother, in a city, Naples, that she had encoded as an anagram into a fake title when everything was taken away. René Auberjonois died in Los Angeles on December 8, 2019, of lung cancer. He was 79 years old. His children, Tessa and Remy, are his descendants. Through them, the line continues, far from Corsica, far from Naples, far from any palace or principality, but continuous. The formal Bonaparte succession is held today by a different line entirely. Jean-Christophe, Prince Napoleon, born in 1986, is a great-great-great-great-nephew of the emperor through the line of Napoleon's brother, Jérôme. He attended Harvard Business School, has worked in investment banking, and married Olympia von Unzuako-Zinneberg in 2019 in a ceremony held at the Château de Chambord. He carries the title as a courtesy. France has been a republic since 1870, and there is no throne to claim. The imperial house of Bonaparte maintains its genealogies and its traditions, but what it is now is a family. An old one, a storied one, but a family rather than a dynasty. Napoleon's only legitimate son, Napoleon II, died of tuberculosis in Vienna in 1832 at 21, without ever having reigned or had children. Napoleon himself left no legitimate descendants. The male dynastic line survived only through Jérôme. The sisters' line is something else, not a line of pretenders, but simply the ordinary continuation of three women's lives through the generations, the imperial names falling away one by one until what's left is a birthplace in New Jersey, a career on Broadway, a Corsican name in the opening credits of a science fiction series. What was left? Letizia Bonaparte outlived almost all of her children. She outlived Napoleon, Elisa, Pauline, and Caroline. She outlived most of the empire they had all inhabited together. She died in Rome in 1836 at 85 years old, having watched the full arc from that house in Ajaccio: the poverty, the flight in the dark, the rise, the courts and palaces, and then the slow reversal of everything. She had always been waiting for the reversal. Her whole life, she had saved money rather than spending it, held things back, kept her private assessment of the good times at a skeptical distance. She had been right to do so, and there is something both admirable and deeply sad about that, about a woman whose wisdom was structured around the expectation of loss. What her three daughters had built during the imperial years was not small. Elisa governed Tuscany. She reformed courts, built roads, supported artists, stood her ground against her own brother when he tried to extract money from territories that couldn't sustain it. She did all of this from the Pitti Palace in Florence, and when she was stripped of it, she went to a house in Trieste and kept excavating, literally and otherwise, until an infection from one of those excavation sites ended her life. Caroline governed Naples during her husband's long military absences, and did it well. She made harder political decisions than most of the men around her. She navigated 10 years of shifting European alliances with real skill, and the calculation she ultimately made, the one that cost her family's forgiveness, kept her alive and her children free. She died in Florence under a name that was an anagram of the city she could never go back to. Pauline never governed anything. She sold her duchy within weeks of receiving it. She spent her considerable energy on living rather than ruling, and she absorbed the social judgment that came with that for decades. And then, when it mattered, when the question was real, and the cost was real, she was the only one who showed up. She went to Elba. She gave her diamonds. She wrote letters from Rome, trying to get better treatment for a brother who was dying on a rock in the South Atlantic. None of them had chosen the empire as the structure of their lives. It had been constructed around them and then pulled away. What they did inside that structure, and after it, is the part that is actually theirs. The marble sculpture still sits in the Borghese Gallery in Rome. People stand in front of it and see Pauline Bonaparte. But Pauline Bonaparte was also on a ship in the Caribbean in 1802, sitting at the bedside of a husband she had not chosen and had come to love anyway, in a heat and danger that most people in her position would have run from. She was 21 years old. She stayed. That is also her. The palaces are museums now. The titles are ceremonial. The territories Elisa reformed and the courts Caroline governed exist as Italian cities, with long memories and short attention for the particular decade when they were governed by a Corsican woman who had learned to rule from a school near Paris and from a family that had walked across rough terrain in the dark with nothing and refused to sit down. But the name travelled. It passed through Lucien in Bordentown and Louis at the 1900 Olympics, and Michel in Cincinnati, and Laure in Paris in 1913. And it arrived in New York in 1940 as the middle name of a man who spent 7 years on television, playing a character who couldn't hold a permanent shape, who was always becoming something, always in the middle of deciding what he was. There is something in that worth sitting with for a while. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.